Hi, and welcome to our evening programming. I'm Molly Webster. I'm a science reporter and a guest host at Radiolab at WNYC Studios, and I'm going to be helping lead us through tonight's conversation. We are talking about the new documentary, Picture a Scientist. It looks at sexism in science, in the lab, in the field, at the bench. It's a very interesting documentary. It drops at such a complex time for our country. And I found that when I was preparing for tonight's talk, I walked away from each of the individual conversations I had with the folks you're going to hear from tonight super inspired. And so I'm even more excited to bring this all together, so that you, the audience out there, can kind of feel that same energy in this moment. Tonight, we're going to be joined by three of the scientists from the film, as well as the filmmakers. If you're online and you're listening, you're watching, we'd love to hear from you and incorporate your thoughts, your questions, your comments into our discussion over the next hour. So you can drop questions into the comments feed section, like under the YouTube live video. And I'll get my eyeballs on those and then pepper them throughout the conversation. We should note there are many people whose faces are not on this screen, but without them, this film would not have been possible. So I'm going to give them a shout out, and maybe you can help me by just, giving me exclamation points in the comments section. But the list of thanks include the Heising Simons Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Nancy Blockman, Sundance Documentary Film Program with support from Sandbox Films, the New York State Council on the Arts, the Wonder Collaborative, Chicken and Egg Pictures, the Educational Foundation of America, and the film's fiscal sponsor, Women Make Movies, plus private donors. And then also the film's producer, Minette Pottle, executive producer, Amy Brand, and publicist and outreach producer, Lisa Munoz. So it feels like it's worth noting that tonight's programming was originally slated to premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City, which shows you in a way just how significant this film is. And so it's really, really cool that we're all getting to gather here tonight and still celebrate the achievement of the scientists and the filmmakers. To introduce my guests, and I would encourage all the guests to give a little wave when I hit your name. In alphabetical order, we have Dr. Rachel Burks, formerly of St. Edward's University in Texas, now at American University in Washington, D.C., Dr. Nancy Hopkins, over at MIT, and Dr. Jane Willenbrigg, who is at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography at UC San Diego. And we've also got our filmmakers, Sharon Shattuck and Ian Chaney. And I should also note before we get started that in order to make this as conversational as possible, we're going to keep the mics open so everyone can chime in as needed. There will obviously be technical difficulties. We may lose people in rural parts of the country when their internet goes down, and we will all just laugh and then gather ourselves and continue on. So, all right, I think we're good to go. I would like to start with Sharon Shattuck, one of the filmmakers. And so, Sharon, I thought this film was really interesting because I know you have a background in science. And so I thought, okay, you didn't walk into this not thinking that there was sexism in science. Like, surely you knew there was sexism in science. So I'm wondering at what moment you were like, oh, this isn't just a known thing. Like, there's a story here that we should make into a documentary.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So my background is in forest ecology, and I went to the University of Michigan as an undergrad, and I've done a lot of field work, and I love the, working in the field, identifying plants. And I think when I was younger, I was a lot like Nancy Hopkins when I talked with Nancy for the first time when we first met and we did our interview, and I'd never gotten a chance to talk to her before this. She was like, when she was starting out, she was like, no, I never even thought about that stuff. Like, I didn't think about being a woman in science. I just wanted to be a scientist. And that's totally how I felt at the time. I didn't notice anything at the time. But what struck me, when we were starting to research this film, we were told about Nancy's story from our executive producer, Amy Brand at MIT. And as we started to talk with the women who did this MIT report that came out in 1999, which is the backbone of Nancy's story in the film, we were struck by how many of them had such a similar experience to me, where when you're young, you don't notice, like it's not really an issue because you're coming up and these older people, mentors are, helping you along, and you're not really a threat, like you're not competing for the same resources. And it wasn't until they were, mature, like when they got, what am I trying to say? When they got tenure, when they were senior faculty, that's when the real problems started to come out for them. And I didn't get to that point. I left science regrettably. I mean, I still love botany, but I turned to filmmaking. And so I wasn't at that point where I was competing for the same resources. But I do wonder now if that will be an issue as as I move up as a filmmaker. I think it's an issue across a lot of disciplines. So we'll see.
Yeah. Nancy, do you want to tell us, I found as I was watching the film, I was intrigued to know just like a little bit more about the MIT report. Do you want to sort of break it down for us as far as how you would describe it to someone?
Yes, well, it was a very surprising thing that it ever happened, actually. And I think because I was one of a very small number of women who were probably the first women to get jobs on the faculty in major research universities. And I think all of us went in, as Sharon just said, thinking, oh, well, this problem was solved, long ago by civil rights or whatever. And I didn't expect to encounter any kind of problem that had to do with my gender. But as time went by, fairly quickly after I joined the faculty, I had problems and I began to realize, but I didn't realize it took a long time to figure out what was going on. I think in that era, you did not talk about these things if you were serious, a woman wanting to be a serious scientist, because if you talked about them, people would think, oh, well, they're having trouble, they must not be good enough, something's wrong with that person. So you just did not talk about it. But after 20 years of dealing with it silently, I got to a point where I just
20 years.
I couldn't continue on and do my job. I just couldn't do it any longer. And so I got up the courage to talk to another woman and ask her if she was having similar problems. And I was thinking of, trying to take some kind of action. And I thought I would be the only one. And I said, I've had these problems. And I've written this letter and I'm thinking of going to send it to the president and see if he'll try to fix these problems for me. And I wanted her opinion. So she read the letter and she said, can I sign this letter and go with you to see the president? I think we ought to go and discuss this with him because I have the same problems. I thought, whoa, this is amazing. And so I found out, I wasn't alone. So ours was a story of a group of women who each one, like Sharon, like me, who individually were going along and doing very well. I mean, getting tenure at MIT is a non-trivial thing. You have to do very well. But we were struggling with this problem individually. And then suddenly we were a group. And so there were 15 tenured women and 195 tenured men at the time, something like that. And overnight we became this group. And suddenly we had some real ability to understand the problem and to actually take it on with MIT through a kind of collective action. So we went from being afraid to even discuss the problem to suddenly being this group of people who felt, oh my goodness, we can do something here. But it was considered still so risky to do it at the time that we used to kind of meet secretly. We didn't, see that many women go into a room all at the same time would have caused alarm. So we used to
causing trouble.
All those women, what are they up to? Anyway, and so they got together and we asked the MIT, the Dean of Science, if we could have a committee to document the problem so that MIT could understand it and then they'd fix it for us. And incredibly, that's what actually happened. I mean, it was quite amazing.
At that point, were you thinking like, I want to document pay or I want to document? I remember in the film, it starts with lab sizes and just space to do experiments. Where did it go from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it turned out a lot of women had been underpaid, and MIT was constantly correcting it before that had been correcting it. But these women were not that interested in pay, actually. They were interested in their ability to do their science. So it's really about the resources you need to do science. And in a place like MIT, there are fabulous resources. So it's getting access to equal resources. I mean, these were people, really driven scientists. And the difficulty of that, and of being sidelined and seeing other people get things easily and you couldn't get, comparable things. It was being excluded from important meetings that would have a professional impact, this kind of stuff. It was really all about that. So we needed data, and scientists we thought the way to convince people is to show them the data. So we collect numerical data and the experiences that women were having, their individual experiences. These were hugely accomplished scientists, so have them tell their stories. And so we did that, and we met, we had a committee, we met for a year, we put the thing together. And as soon as it was down on paper, the dean started fixing everything that he could. And then, of course, the big surprise was when it became public several years later. And then we discovered we weren't just 15 women dealing with this problem. It was a universal problem. And I honestly am embarrassed to say I didn't really even understand that at the time. It turned out to be this universal problem.
Oh, one more question on the report. Was there something that made it into the final report that surprised you, that not so much the emotions or the anecdotes, but like a fact that you found out, or a discovery that you made just from collecting the data?
Yes, I mean, I thought it would be very hard to document it, but every time I went and looked, people had simply not looked at the data. MIT tried to look at data. They try very hard to be equitable. So they do look at salary data. They constantly correct it if they see inequity. But people hadn't known where to look until you had women go through the system. So, for example, on grants, where you have a topic of a grant and a group of people get together all to write a grant together. In department after separate departments, different fields, you would find the woman would be left out. The woman would be left out. The woman would be left out. A group of people get together to do something. The woman would be left out. The fact that the data was so stunning when you actually got to see it, that it supported the perceptions these women had, but they both had this feeling, am I right about this? And
right.
So it was hearing the stories. Interestingly, the president of MIT and the dean of science that we worked with, Bob Birgeneau, they said it was the stories of the women that convinced them more than, to me, seeing the data, the numerical data was what was remarkable. But I think since it's such a small number of people, for them, it was the stories of these extremely accomplished women scientists. They realized how hard they had to work to achieve the same level of success.
Well, it's interesting. It's sometimes we forget that even anecdotal is data. Like as it builds up, it becomes its own source of data. It is data.
It is. Yeah.
Jane, I'm wondering, as someone whose story was featured so prominently in the film, a similar question to you, because one of the things Nancy and I talked about before the call was differences between experiences that younger women might have today versus older women, and how that goes over, and like how that sort of changed over time. I'm wondering, did you walk into science thinking there's sexism here, there's a thing I have to look out for, or was that something that developed over time?
So it was interesting hearing Sharon's answer about that, because I didn't even have a neutral view of it. I thought it was harmful to talk about women in science. I always took a lot of pride in, being able to do things that men could do. And so I thought just by calling attention to it, it would be detrimental to women in geology, where, field work and being, physically fit enough to do field work is so important, that I thought that drawing attention to that topic was not only irrelevant, but that was actually harming us. And, one thing that I hear from women all the time is that they had sort of a similar view, or maybe a neutral view, until they didn't, right? Until something comes up. And then suddenly, once you start to see it, it's all over. And I think that is one of the great things about this film, is that, now that people maybe can see some of the examples, they'll look for examples in their own lives, and it will be, even more of a realization for everybody that it's happening all over.
Yeah, it seems like getting everyone talking about it in some way.
And similar to harassment too, right? Like, I sort of thought that I was alone, like that I was the 0.00001% of women who are harassed in the field. And it turns out that it's half, right? And so it's not by talking to, until you talk to other people, that you actually find out that it's such a huge issue.
Is that really the number? It's something like half?
Mhm.
Wow, that's crazy. Rachel, I see your hand going up and I want to hear your point. And I also wanted to ask you, coming off of this, one of the things you talk about in the film is representation. I think we've all had the feeling of like there aren't women represented in science. So like trying to find your own path or find like a woman to look up to follow their path. You had the double issue of where are the women of color in science. And so I was curious when you had a moment when you found that person for the first time. So that question and your follow-up thoughts.
So I think, it's interesting, the perspectives is that I've always known that there's serious issues that are dangerous and make it unsafe for me to live. And there's a certain talk, right? And maybe a lot of the audience members and folks here know that there's a different conversation that parents of Black children have with their kids than parents of other kids maybe have. And maybe there are some marginalized communities, which is, you need to do this, this, and this to come home at night. And I remember my dad telling me, we can all feel bad when you make it home, but you don't get to be indignant with like the police or a white authority figure. When you get home, we'll all feel angry for you, but you need to get home first. So that'll mean you're going to have to trade, quite honestly, your dignity for your safety. That's what I learned as a kid.
And just being a human in this world. Yeah.
To exist, to get to school, to go home, to go to the mall, to go to the store. And so I've always known that you have to really, there's a level of self-policing. And there's a video that's been floating around of this little boy just playing hoops in his driveway, right? So Black boy. He sees this cop car and he immediately goes behind the car well to hide in his own home, in his own driveway, with the hoops. And I, saw that video. I'm like, yes. And that's how it is going into work. And the number of times I was told, like, you're really loud and aggressive in meetings. And I'm like, well, you asked for anyone have any ideas. And I don't think I'm speaking. There's a lot of this angry Black woman, or you're very aggressive. Mm-hmm. And that started when I was little in classes, that kind of regulation of behavior. And there's a great term that a queer Black feminist came up with, gosh, I think it was back in 2010. It's misogynoir, right? It's this intersection of misogyny and racism, and particularly anti-Blackness. So I've always been aware of that. And that's an important thing to know, is that all of our experience as women, while we have these places where there's definitely a Venn diagram, right? I watched everyone's story going, oh my God, you can share these experiences, but then there's also real differences, right? And I think about like my DACA students, and I mean, there's, this is Pride Month. I think about all of these things that I experiences that I don't know anything about. Right. But I would definitely say that for me, not talking about it was more because I didn't want to be unsafe. And I mean that professionally unsafe, like maybe I won't get invited to meetings, or maybe I won't get certain opportunities, but literally physically unsafe. I don't want campus security called to my office or a classroom. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be followed through campus by the cops. I don't want to go to my dorm room and get harassed by, there's all of these other things. And even in STEM, right? Like, at the end of the day, like, how do people see you? I don't have any control over that. So when I looked at, who are kind of role models, it's also who we were allowed to see, and I grew up in LA, and I went through school system at LA Unified. And you would think in just that area, right, there'd be like all kinds of and I can tell you, like, even when my niece went through decades later, it's a very different experience. Like, things have changed a lot. It's funny because one of my, a lot of my heroes are fake. I mean that in like.
So this is like maybe the first person you saw was a fake person.
Well, it was like Uhura in Star Trek, right? I would watch Star Trek on Nick at Night with my dad, which was already right in like loop syndication at that point, right? So, but to see this person who had this skilled technical job in space, right? And that was, I'm like, wow, or you would see, then you start really trying to dig up, and you see folks like, well, I'm a McNair scholar. So, like Ronald McNair and that whole journey, Mae Jemison, right? Like, and you start getting later examples. But when I went to school, there was a thing on Twitter a couple of days ago, like, when's the first time you had a Black professor or a Black teacher? Right. And the first time I had, well, definitely a science Black educator was a math professor in college. I never had a Black chemistry professor. I never had, I think there was one, when I went to graduate school, there was one woman professor.
It's crazy that a space character is somehow the most realistic person that you've gotten as a model, but it's so true. So people have reflected on this. I want to, Ian, this was something you guys talk about in the film, and we have a question from a listener, Ben, about the iceberg idea. This is something Rachelle's really pointing at. There's the overt sexual harassment things that Jane talks about in the film, and then there are other things that you're like, was that not? So can you sort of break down this iceberg idea that you have in the film? And I believe it's one of the reasons you felt like, let's do this film, like, let's point at this iceberg stuff.
Yeah, that's right. I think it was Dr. Kate Clancy who first brought up the metaphor of the iceberg for us, and it was really, kind of immediately illuminating. And I think they used the iceberg in the big NAS report that's referenced in the film. And I think the idea is probably pretty familiar to folks. What you see above the water are the most egregious acts that probably make headlines. Assault and really, overt instances of sexism that are, maybe even against the law. And then everything below the water is, of course, an enormous mass of everyday slights, microaggressions, things that may not necessarily be against the law, but are profoundly impactful for people on the receiving end. And this, we try to kind of tally up really a small sample of these as we move through the film and understand what it's like, to be Dr. Burks in the chemistry lab, or Dr. Hopkins in the biology lab, so it can be everything from being, left off of a grant that you really should be a part of, or people speaking over you in meetings, or I think Rachelle had a really good one that I think, we all were immediately nodding at, you say an idea, she says an idea, and nobody kind of tags onto it, and then 2 minutes later, somebody who looks like me says the same idea, and everybody's like, "Oh yeah!"
Everyone's like, "Totally, yeah."
How
that's
profound!
So yes, yes.
So that's the idea, and I think, I think it's a very powerful, simple metaphor, and I think it's been helpful for us too, because in thinking about how to change that iceberg, I think it's really important to recognize not only how invisible a lot of that stuff is to a lot of people who aren't paying attention to it, but also how massive it is, and how much inertia it has, and how it's been built up over, really centuries.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I want to point out we lost to Jane. I don't see her. I'm assuming she'll come back, and we'll welcome her with welcome arms.
Sure, yeah.
In the meantime, you
Don't leave us.
you do point out that like if you point at things on the iceberg, if we're all thinking about them, like maybe we can start to fix them. And so Nancy, I'll turn to you and say, and this is a question from one of the listeners, Kiera, I hope, which is, and maybe other people will have ideas too, how did departments tackle the issue of leaky pipelines in STEM academia? Like once you start noticing the problem, how do you start to make attempts to fix it?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's obviously the really important question. Okay, well, first you have to document the problem, which we know is the hard thing. You have to speak up, and then you've got to get people's attention, then you've got to convince them it's true. That's actually the really hard part. Once you get the buy-in of the institution, people in power, then you're ready to go. I mean, that was the real breakthrough, I think, that happened at MIT. People listened to these women once they had this collective group. And then how do you respond? And you've got to examine every step of the process. You've got to get the data. You've got to examine the process that produces that result. And then you've got to design a new process and try it out and see if it works and track the data and then institutionalize it and make a new policy. So, it turns out that the pipeline leaks at different places in different fields of science, which is very interesting. So, you have to really understand what's going on at a deep level to make.
So like geology might lose women or scientists of color at a different place than chemistry or biology or neuroscience.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder why. Huh.
Well, that's the question. Of course, you've got to figure out why. And it's fascinating. It's a long story. We could talk on that for the rest of the hour. So you have to figure it out, and then you have to come up with ideas and policies to change it. It turns out at the faculty level, which is where I spend most of my time, and again, each field's different. Sometimes some fields you lose the women as freshmen. Sometimes you lose them between college, high school and college. Sometimes you lose them after the BA. At every stage, it can happen. It turned out for us, the issue was hiring. So then you have to look at, well, why aren't we hiring women? So is it a pipeline problem, or are they really there and we're not hiring them? And it turned out in my generation, they really were there. We weren't hiring them often. So then you have to say why. So then you have to change your hiring process. If you keep doing the same thing, you'll keep getting the same result. So you engage with the administration, and these were really fascinating things to be involved in a university and see how it was done by a collaboration of the people who had the problem with the people who had the power to fix the problem. Looking at the hiring process, the dean would help. The search has to be broad. The dean would demand that you bring in applicants. I mean, show me the people you interviewed. Why didn't you interview this person? What happened? And once they did that, you could see the jump. I mean, you can look at the data and you can see the impact of this.
One question, a follow-up question for you, Nancy, and then Rachel, I want a question for you. But one of the things I was so impressed about with the MIT report, and even just hearing your answer now, is the doggedness. In the sense of like you have your first meeting where you write a letter because you're really frustrated you don't have enough lab space, and then someone signs on to that letter and you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then maybe like 5 more people get in and there's like some momentum, but then it's just like you're on meeting 57 with someone who's asking for more data, or you're on year 3. I mean, how you collected data for so long to get to the point where the dean would actually listen to you. Like, I feel like I've fallen away at meeting 37. And so I just wonder about the chutzpah, like to keep going. Like, how do you, or maybe I'm easily, assuaged by smooth talkers where somehow my anger gets mollified. And so I just wonder, like, how you, for all of us, like, how do we stay with it?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, I think certainly speaking from a personal point of view, I had been alone with this problem for, nearly 20 years. And suddenly I had a group of people who all agreed, And I had a responsive dean and a responsive president and then a responsive provost who wanted to help fix it. So I was on cloud nine. I mean, it was just so much better than being alone, grappling with the problem and trying to get the space you needed to do the work of whatever it was. So yeah, it's a lot of work, but it was a fascinating thing. And I think not being alone and suddenly having the support, it was a whole different ballgame. But what I found frustrating is, okay, after we did that and they made these changes, I thought, okay, I got that one done. Now, done,
I'm
right?
going to Hawaii. Like,
Yeah.
done. Great done.
Oh,
I think the hard part for me and watching this movie, which I found so moving really, was, when the NAS report, the National Academy of Sciences report came out, was realizing that 20 years later, the problem had not completely gone away. You know, that was hard for me and has been hard for me. And so at the beginning, it was so exciting because we really made progress. And then it turned out it had a national impact. And I was going around talking to all these women and they all had the same. We were all so excited it's going to change. And it did change. There's been huge progress. And then it's like, I don't know, we hit a plateau. So when I see younger women grappling with the problems I did, that I find very, very painful.
Yeah. Rachel, one of the things you speak a lot about, or one of the things I hear when you speak is the word safe and this concept of safety. And as we're talking about speaking up, I wonder, what do you think is safety that would allow someone to speak up?
Well, I think there are different levels of harm. There are different types of harm, right? There's literally decisions. And I think a lot, here's one unifying thing, definitely white women, women of color, cis women, trans women. Sometimes we change what we say, how we say it, if we say anything, because we literally feel physically threatened. Because we see what happened. Like, this isn't like, oh, she's too sensitive. No. This is data driven, right? Like, you make these changes, right? And so you get this data. So there's physical safety. But for a lot of women, there is financial safety. They are, they got to pay that rent. And they got to, keep food on the table.
Right.
And we see that over and over again. And I think there's also like psychological health, right? I think there is this cost, right? A real cost to nothing. You feel like nothing has changed. And there are some days where that's a totally valid thing, right? I feel like right now I'm like deja vu. Like I lived through the Rodney King LA riot. I mean, this is just another, right? And you can get like almost, right, psychologically exhausted. And so there's levels of safety. And so you have to feel at some point, some level of safety to make a disclosure. Whoever that's to, right? Whether it's to a friend, because you have trust there. Definitely if there's a power differential in the situation or the person you're talking to. And so sometimes if someone says, well, I never knew that, or gosh, why didn't I? And I'm like, maybe it's because they didn't feel safe with you. Like, or with me, right? With these disclosures. Because this is about threatening behavior. I think the thing with whether it's misogyny or white supremacy, it is constant, never-ending threats to physical safety, financial safety, and psychological or mental health, your health safety.
And then how do we build in the safety part and to minimize the threats? Like, what would be your thoughts on implementing safety?
Well, when we talk about changing systems and culture, right? Sometimes with the leaky pipeline, the conversation becomes too much about recruitment when the issue is, and then they'll switch over to retention, right? But to really get to the point where you have safety, it means you have to have an actual environment and culture of respect, and a person has agency, right? And you actually do the work of, it can't just be like, an external ombudsman. Like, you have departments now that are, and there have been, like, getting back to Nancy's point about the work that was done, there's a time when different universities, right, have very different situations, different workplaces, right, have very different cultures and environments. There comes a time where you have got to do the work, right, to really be aggressive with your anti-racism policies and your anti-sexism, and examine, you know, are we trans friendly? Are we LGBTQI? I mean, all of those things, like, are we really being thoughtful and mindful to all of our practices so that people feel safe, bringing the whole person, which is when we get maximum productivity, right? Like, you want to, you know, do they feel safe there? And that is not so much about slapping up a sign, or, you know, it's about, people have got to do the work and really examine their explicit and implicit biases. And it's uncomfortable work, because you have got to really make some changes to yourself, to your department, to your, like, it starts from, and then it moves outward. Mm-hmm. And when you start really examining and being honest, and it gets back to Nancy's point, you know, you got to get your house in order, as my mom would say, but collect the data, right? And examine it, and really get to the point where you're changing your department's whole culture. And the thing that, you know, that Nancy is, you don't actually need a majority. Like, you don't need 50% of the faculty to be on board, right, with that. That's not how it started, right? It started with one person talking to one other person, then getting another group of people, then signing on the key person that then said, you're going to do that, right? Like, yeah. It got there, maybe it got there, but what is the thing that, like, got the ball rolling? And so what I'm seeing, and there have been places, right, where really great work has been done to change. You know, they talk a lot about, especially in academia, about culture shifts. Yeah. Right? Almost academic bingo, right? Like, oh, she said culture shift, or, you know, this work. And it starts with the department really saying, you know, we have a problem here. We may not know what the depth of the problem is, but let's just say that, let's start doing the work, right? Yeah. And let's start looking at how, even if we think we're great, what if we just did it anyway?
I want to call in Nancy because she's getting excited. Go ahead, Nancy.
Well, I agree with what Rachel said, but I think there's something else about this problem. When I started working on it, so long before many of you were born, maybe even, I'm not sure, but we really didn't know anything about it. Today, we know a huge amount about this problem, actually. And that's thanks to these psychologists like Mazrin Banaji, this wonderful, extraordinary psychologist at Harvard who was in the movie. The study of unconscious bias is a monumental contribution of science, I believe. I think it's one of the great discoveries that's been made in really biology. And so we do, and that was one of the most exciting things to me, was when we were going through this. For not understanding it, then coming to find other people who understood the problem, and then learning about this literature and research that was going on to help us understand, why is it so hard to fix these problems? Why is it so slow? Mm-hmm. And people actually know the answers. So
that is one of the striking things. Is I think I always thought of unconscious bias as like almost like a pure level sociological, cultural issue. But if you look at the data and see what the film says, you see that then that cultural, social thing gets embedded in a biological way, which I still don't fully understand, just because my brain is slow. But it's so, I'm like, oh, there's like a biological level to this. I don't even know what to do with that. But yeah, what is the data there?
It's absolutely fascinating. And I sort of wish I'd studied this more as from an academic point of view. It's not my field, so I'm not the expert on it. You'd have to ask Mazrin Banaji or Liz Spelke, these amazing women psychologists at Harvard. But, but if you ask them, how do you fix this problem? The simplest answer they'll give you is, you have to change the world and the biases will change with it. So, for example,
great, cool.
So that's what we're working on, Rachel. We're just changing the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then it'll all be done. So here's I was looking at one of Mazrin's papers this week. We're friends, and I was talking with her about all this, and she said, okay, here's what she writes. In 1958, only 4% of white Americans approved of black-white marriages. Today, it's over 90%. Okay, so how did those attitudes change? Attitudes do change, and they can actually now measure explicit and implicit biases. They can measure them, and they can watch them change over time. And it's kind of, people think, oh, well, time passed and so everything changed. No, time didn't just pass and everything changed. No, people worked on it for decades to bring about these moments when suddenly you can have a Me Too moment. Suddenly you have this extraordinary thing that's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement that's been electrified recently. I think because it didn't just happen from one incident, it happened over decades of hard work. But it does change, and they can see it change, and they can see the different biases we have. Some have changed, some haven't. Some have changed more with women than with men. So there's real progress. So
then it's like digging in and figuring out, how did that 90% change happen, and why did it happen in some groups faster than others? You're saying, like, really pull it apart.
You weren't there through the 60s, right?
I wasn't.
No, you were, I don't know, a baby. I mean, but those of us, so when people say there's been no change in my lifetime, for me, the change that has occurred in these things is enormous, both for Blacks and for women. And in science now, I mean, it's just a different world for women than it was when I started. So you have to live long enough to see it, because it's such a slow process.
Good God. Wait, we have Jane back, which I'm very excited about. Jane.
No, Jane, you're back.
I'm so sorry we haven't
Jane.
been able to fully utilize you. You had a comment, you're about to jump in. And then then after that, I have a question from one of the viewers for you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, even if people don't come all the way, and we don't have 90%, as many people were saying, that agree, about some of these topics, I think a lot of the strides that we've made is, like, what is socially acceptable? And so, like, going back to, interracial marriages, if you look on, like, Match.com, I happen to know about this because it's my husband's area of research. So if you look at, like, who actually dates out of their race, it's actually, like, much less than, like, people who are generally supportive of the idea, right? And so I think that that's a really interesting analogy to what has to happen in science. It has to become, like, socially acceptable, and even, like, an imperative that you signal to other people that this is true. And then it becomes, I think it does help it become a bit more of a safe space, right? If it's socially unacceptable to have the wrong view about equity and inclusion and diversity, I think that that's quite helpful. So if everybody in the department, if people, even if they don't believe it, even if they stifle those feelings, I think that's helpful.
And
you don't want those.
I agree with you, Jane, because I think if you're waiting for kind of a true conversion,
there's lots of nods.
Let's be honest, you'd be waiting for a real long time. Put a call next to you, because by the time you're done, that will be a diamond, and you'll have your true believers, right? But I was talking to a friend of mine who's a biology professor, and we were both, you have good days and bad days where you feel really defeated. Like, when you're trying to change the world, there are some real bad days. I said, you don't actually need, it feels like you need everyone to be a true believer. I'm like, I don't actually think you do. I'm lucky enough to know a lot of colleagues in sociology. You need some true believers, and you actually need people, kind of a chunk in the middle, to be like, I don't want to be on the wrong side of history. Right?
You're just like, I'm a sheeple. I'm moving with it.
I can see where the tide is going, and I do not want to be on the wrong, like, when the arc of justice bends, I do not want it to point at me.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So this gets at one of the ideas that's come up in different ways, best described as allies. Something Ian and Sharon, you talk about in the film a little. Jane, the complex character of, was it Alex? Is that the name of
Adam.
Adam, sorry. Adam in the film. I'm curious I'll start with you, Jane. I'm curious, like, what you think it means for someone to be an ally, especially having gone through such an abrasive situation.
Yeah. So, so I think, I hope that if people watch the film, they do see Adam as being like a complex person who was on, a personal journey of growth, as we all are. And I truly consider him to be an ally even back then, even though I know, a lot of people had the opposite view after reading like some of the initial science reports. I mean, there are a lot of power dynamics out there too. So, for example, he had two small children and was supporting a family on a grad school salary, right? And had his own plans to go to, get a PhD and things like that. And so I think that, it's hard to put I guess for me, it was hard to imagine a scenario where either of us would have fared well in that, right? And so you have to think about, what your role is as an ally too. I know now, being on the other side of that, it's pretty easy to just say like, let me report that for you, right? And that is not, in some cases, the safest thing to do for that person. And so if Adam had gone to someone and said, told them what happened in the field and what are some of the things that were said, I still don't think anything good would have come from it. And B, it was not my wish for someone to report for me. And so I think that it always has to be, in the hands of the harassment and discrimination, survivor to actually decide what the ally needs to do.
Absolutely.
Ian, I feel like you were jotting. Anything you wanted to chime in? Or is that just putting you on the spot too much?
Oh, a compulsive note taker. Yeah, I think I think something I came away with, at least as a thought, when working on the film, was this idea of, in being an ally, is that there's always something you can do, even if that something is just listening, to Jane and saying, okay, I've got your back. If you want me to speak up, I will. I think it's probably pretty common for men to feel, I don't know, either, overwhelmed or confused, or like there's so many things that they need to do, but they haven't ever done any of them. And so, inaction is so kind of attractive. And I think, what we tried to show a little bit in the film is both Adam Lewis and then Bob Brown, who was provost at MIT, and then later, of course, at BU. I mean, they took a kind of action. Those are actions that probably most men, won't find themselves with the opportunity to take. But there's got to be something you can do, and I think that's something that men in this space, in science and society, need to really own. I mean, I think the path forward is paved with men taking action. So.
Yeah. Rachel, I'm curious, and we have a question from a listener, Megana. I hope I'm pronouncing, I feel like I might be butchering all of these names. She says, as a current graduate student and woman of color, I find it difficult to maintain my love of science in light of bias. Can you speak to how you maintained your love of science? And Jane, I feel, and honestly, anyone in the room, whoever wants to go quickest can, but it feels like a note to move towards is maintaining passion in the midst of all this. But Rachel, we'll start with you.
so I had to separate, right? There's the profession, there's the process, and then there's the body of knowledge. And I'm not saying this is in my own mind how to separate and categorize these things. And I did this across subjects and across work experiences, just to deal with certain things, is that the profession and the small environment you're in right now might be total dumpster fire.
Yeah.
That's this. But what you have with the subject you love is between you and the subject. And I encourage you, and I'm speaking to you, whoever wrote that, sorry, I forgot your name, is Daniel Radcliffe's letter, I think is actually really speaks to this issue, even though he was talking to Harry Potter fans. Whatever that meant to you is only between you and what it, and this subject. So, it's between me and what I love about chemistry, and the profession of chemistry or a department or a certain job might let you down, because people, sometimes we're great, sometimes we're real jerks, right? But whatever that is, for me, it was like, okay, so this love I have right here, I keep it separate from the profession. And sometimes my frustration, even with processes, and I'm an analytical chemist, I love nothing but a process. But but that helped me. And I sometimes, you tell yourself these things every day, is what is it I love about discovery? What is it I love about teaching? Like, separate from any other living person, is what is that little nugget? And there will be days where it's that nugget that will get you through that thing. And the thing is, environments can change. And I know that we're not all sometimes in the position to change an environment. I'm totally recognizing that. And I feel uncomfortable sometimes recommending people endure, because I asked, my first question is, what are we asking them to endure? But I feel like for me, it was, let me separate out this from what I love about this subject or the process of discovery. And that is just what I wanted to hold on to that. And nobody was going to take that love from me. And I might walk away or make a different just career choice, but I still get to come in and leave with the love that I nurtured and developed. That doesn't have anything to do with what goes on in these STEM streets. That's just for me.
And I get STEM streets. Nancy or Jane, do you have follow-ups and additional thoughts? Jane, you go. Oh, Nancy, you go. Go, everyone go. Nancy, go.
I mean, I think it's hard to say it better than what Rachel just said, because I think that if you have that passion for science, it is so extreme and so intense and so overwhelming. You hang on to that and you just hold it close. And for myself, I can't imagine having had a life without science. I mean, and I still, even though I'm retired, I still read papers. I still get so excited about results that I read about. So you've got that. It belongs to you, and nobody can take that away. Don't let anyone take that from you. I think the other thing is, science is hard. You have to always be tough to be a scientist, because if you're doing anything worthwhile, people tell you it's wrong and you should be doing something else. I mean, if you're doing regular science, by definition, almost, it's going to be upsetting somebody. So you've got to learn that toughness early on anyway. And this is just another kind of toughness. And I think, in answer to your question also, Molly, how do you keep fighting? Because it's worth fighting for. It's so fabulous science that it is really worth the fight. And I think for those of us who stay on as activists, worth the fight for others also. I mean, I think we all want to see the generation come after us have an easier time so they can just indulge in this passion. And then finally, I think, what I regret about my own life was being alone those first 20 years. I wish I had sought some kind of collective help from others and not been so intimidated to speak out about it. Because realizing you're not alone was hugely important. But do not give it up.
Wow. Jane?
So echo completely everything that was just said. I just would add that and this is a terrible way to like leave things, but there are times when I stuck with it entirely out of spite.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, I love
No, I think that's a great thing
Yes.
to quit. Let's be real here,
I
folks.
am very spiteful.
Yeah.
Like I could not give them the pleasure of having me quit, you know? and then at other times it was more, you know, joy of science. There was definitely some joy of science in there too, but there was some spite. And then the other thing about the profession that's been a real joy on the other side of tenure is being able to help other people and to create a process and a profession that I'm proud of. And so that is the other thing that gets me going. Like every time I see an injustice or an indignity, like it keeps me going to think that I can actually, like at this point in my career, do something about it. And so that's incredibly inspiring to me.
Wow. Sharon, I want you to tell us how more people can watch this film.
Yes. Okay. So right now, until June 26th, the film is available in the United States at www.pictureascientist.com. That's our website. Mm-hmm. And you can go there and you can pick a theater that you want to support anywhere in the US, and you can buy tickets and watch the film from the comfort of your own home. And also what's happening now is we've launched our educational screening campaign, and what that means is that you can request a screening of the film at your university or at your corporation or whatever institution you want to bring the film to. You can send us a request in the request form, and we can make that happen for you. And so that's going to be going all through the fall into, I think, through the end of the year and beyond. But that's really like, we're hoping to get a lot of requests for the summer and the fall, fall of 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then to be continued, like stay tuned for more announcements, and hopefully we'll be able to have some amazing news coming soon.
It is cool because also I want to underline private and corporation, because we did get some questions which we weren't able to get to, but just about, we've been focusing a lot on academia, but obviously these issues happen in private science, in companies. And so that's just something for us all to be aware of. And I just want to say, this has been such an interesting, fun, amazing conversation, but that's not just coming from me. When you sign off, you will see there's really so many amazing comments online from different listeners. I'm saying listeners, but they're obviously watching too. One, Jane, your stories of strength and perseverance. Generally, we're just so impressed. Someone from Brazil is watching. Lots of applause and thank you so much. And so I do want to echo all of those things. Let me think. Do we have any final thoughts? You have 30 seconds.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Thank you for watching. We're so grateful. I'm so happy that Ian and I got to make this movie, and I'm so grateful to Rachel and Nancy and Jane and Kate Clancy and Mazar and Banaji and all the amazing scientists we got to feature.
We'll just do a round of applause to give everyone the standing ovation they should have gotten at Tribeca. So I'm doing that now. I want to thank Dr. Rachel Burks, Dr. Nancy Hopkins, Dr. Jane Willenbrigg, and Ian Chaney and Sharon Shattuck, and all of you for watching. Thank you so much. And if you want to host, I'm going to say the URL again. If you want to host a screening of Picture a Scientist, go to pictureascientist.com. And I think that's it for us. Bye. I'm going to do the jazz hands.
Thank you.
Thank you.